On a freezing night in the Wild West, a mysterious girl walked out of the darkness and asked a lonely cowboy one simple question. "Can I warm up by your fire?" But minutes later, armed riders appeared, claiming she belonged to them. What the cowboy did next would change both of their lives forever. The cold night, the wind moved across the Texas plains like a restless ghost. It was the kind of cold that slipped through clothes and settled deep into a man's bones. The stars above were sharp and endless, scattered across the sky like shattered glass. Jacob Turner sat beside a small campfire, staring into the flames. He had been riding since sunrise. His horse, Dusty, stood nearby with its head low, chewing slowly on dry grass. The saddle creaked softly whenever the horse shifted its weight. Jacob rubbed his hands together and leaned closer to the fire. Life on the frontier had taught him many things: how to survive storms, how to track cattle for miles, how to fight when necessary. But the one thing he had never learned was how to forget. 3 years ago, he had lost everything: his ranch, his home, and the woman he loved. The memories still followed him everywhere, like shadows that refused to fade. Jacob tossed another piece of wood into the fire. Sparks jumped into the dark air before disappearing. Just one more night, he muttered to himself. He was headed toward the small town of Silver Creek. A cattle buyer there owed him money, and Jacob planned to collect before moving farther west. That had been the plan. Until he heard footsteps. Soft ones, slow and uncertain. Jacob's hand immediately moved toward the revolver resting beside his saddle. Out here, unexpected visitors rarely meant good news. The footsteps stopped just beyond the firelight. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a quiet voice broke through the darkness. "May I warm up by your fire?" Jacob stiffened. The voice was soft, and unmistakably female. He slowly stood, his eyes scanning the shadows. A young woman stepped forward into the light of the flames. She looked exhausted. Her long brown hair was tangled by the wind, and her dress was dusty from travel. A thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders, though it did little to protect her from the cold. In her hands, she held a small cloth bag. That was all. No horse, no wagon, no weapon. Jacob studied her carefully. Traveling alone in the middle of the frontier was dangerous enough for a man. For a woman, it was almost unheard of. "You alone?" he asked. The woman nodded slowly. "Yes." Her voice trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. Jacob glanced across the empty plains behind her. Nothing moved. No riders, no lanterns, no sound except the wind. He hesitated. Trouble often came disguised as innocence. But something about her didn't feel like trouble. She looked desperate. Jacob stepped aside and pointed toward the fire. "You can sit." Relief flashed across her face. "Thank you." She moved closer to the flames and carefully lowered herself onto a small rock. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly between them. The woman stretched her hands toward the warmth, her fingers shaking from the cold. Jacob noticed small cuts across her knuckles. Signs of someone who had been traveling hard. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. "Emily." Jacob nodded. "I'm Jacob." Another silence followed. Dusty snorted quietly nearby. Emily watched the fire as if it were the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. After a moment, Jacob reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small tin container. "Beans. Not much, but enough." He set it near the fire. "You hungry?" Emily looked up quickly. For a second, pride seemed to battle with hunger in her eyes. Then hunger. Yes." Jacob handed her a spoon. She began eating slowly at first, but within moments the pace quickened. It was clear she hadn't eaten in a while. Jacob looked away to give her some dignity. The night grew quieter. The fire burned lower, and for the first time in a long while, Jacob didn't feel completely alone. But something still bothered him. A woman didn't wander the frontier alone without a reason. And whatever Emily's reason was, Jacob had a feeling it was bigger than she was ready to admit. Finally, he spoke again. "Where you headed?" Emily stopped eating. Her spoon froze halfway to her mouth. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she lowered the spoon and stared into the flames. "I don't know." Jacob frowned. "You don't know." She shook her head slowly. "I'm just trying to get away." Jacob had heard that answer before. Many times. People ran from things all the time out here. Debt, enemies, the law. But Emily didn't look like someone running from money or crime. She looked like someone running from something far worse. Jacob leaned back against his saddle. "Well," he said quietly, "you picked a dangerous place to wander." Emily gave a weak smile. "I didn't pick it." The wind grew stronger. The flames danced wildly. Jacob studied her again. Something about her story didn't add up. A lone woman, no horse, no supplies, walking across the plains in the middle of winter. It didn't make sense, unless she had escaped something, and that thought made Jacob uneasy. Because if she was running from someone, there was a good chance they were still looking for her. Jacob stared out into the darkness beyond the fire. The plains stretched endlessly under the moonlight. Quiet, empty, but the frontier had taught him one important rule. Trouble often arrived when the night was at its quietest. And tonight, the silence felt too deep. The truth she was hiding. The fire crackled softly as the night stretched deeper across the Texas plains. Jacob leaned back against his saddle, watching the flames dance while the wind whispered through the tall grass. Across from him, Emily sat quietly. She had finished the beans but still held the empty tin in her hands as if the warmth from it might last longer. For a while, neither of them spoke. Out here, silence was normal. Men who spent their lives on the frontier often grew comfortable without conversation. But this silence felt different. It felt heavy, like something unspoken was sitting between them. Jacob finally broke it. "You walked far." Emily nodded slightly. "Since morning." Jacob's eyebrows lifted. "On foot?" "Yes. That's a long way to travel without a horse." She didn't answer. Jacob studied her face carefully. Up close, she looked even younger than he first thought, maybe 20, maybe less. But her eyes carried the kind of exhaustion that usually belonged to someone much older. "You from around here?" he asked. Emily stared into the fire again. "No." "Then where?" She hesitated. For a moment, it seemed like she might refuse to answer. But finally she whispered, "East of here. A small settlement near the Brazos River." Jacob nodded slowly. He knew the area. A scattering of farms and ranches. Hard land, hard people. "What made you leave?" Emily's fingers tightened around the tin container. The firelight flickered across her face, revealing a sudden tension in her expression. "That's not important," she said quietly. Jacob tilted his head. "Usually is." Emily gave a faint, tired smile. "You ask a lot of questions for a man who just met me." Jacob shrugged. "Out here, questions keep a man alive." She couldn't argue with that. The wind blew stronger, making the flames lean sideways. Emily pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Jacob noticed. Without a word, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a spare wool blanket. He tossed it toward her. "Take it." Emily looked surprised. "I can't." "You can." She hesitated, then slowly wrapped the blanket around herself. "Thank you." Jacob nodded and returned his attention to the fire. Minutes passed. The quiet returned again, but this time, Emily spoke first. "Why are you out here alone?" Jacob didn't answer immediately. That question always carried memories he preferred to keep buried. "Work," he said finally. "What kind of work?" "Cattle." She nodded slowly. "You're a rancher." "Was." That single word carried more weight than an entire story. Emily sensed it. "What happened?" she asked softly. Jacob poked the fire with a stick. The sparks rose into the dark sky. "Life happened." Emily didn't push further. She understood that kind of answer. People running from their past often recognized it in others. The fire burned lower. Jacob added another piece of wood. For a while, they both watched the flames again. Then Jacob noticed something. Emily kept glancing over her shoulder into the darkness. Not casually, nervously. The kind of look someone gave when they feared being followed. Jacob's eyes narrowed slightly. You expecting someone? Emily froze. Her eyes quickly returned to the fire. No. Jacob wasn't convinced. You sure? Yes. Her answer came too fast. Jacob leaned forward slightly. You running from somebody? Emily's breathing became shallow. For several seconds she didn't speak. The silence stretched. Then finally she whispered, I told you, I'm just trying to get away. Jacob watched her closely. There was fear in her eyes now. Real fear. And he had seen that look before. Usually on people who had escaped something terrible. He leaned back again. All right, he said calmly. Your business. Emily seemed relieved he didn't press further. But Jacob's instincts were awake now. Something about this situation wasn't right. The plains were too empty for someone like her to survive long alone. Which meant she must have left recently. And if she left recently, whoever she was running from might not be far behind. The thought sat heavily in Jacob's mind. Suddenly Dusty lifted his head. The horse gave a quiet snort. Jacob's body tensed instantly. He turned his head toward the darkness. Emily noticed the change in his posture. What is it? She asked nervously. Jacob raised a hand, signaling for silence. He listened carefully. The wind blew across the plains. The fire crackled, and then, very faint, but unmistakable, hoofbeats. Far away, but coming closer. Emily's face turned pale. Jacob looked at her sharply. You said you weren't expecting anyone. Emily's lips trembled. I didn't think they'd find me this fast. Jacob stood up slowly. His eyes scanned the horizon. The hoofbeats were clearer now. More than one horse. At least 3, maybe 4 riders. Emily's hands began shaking. They can't take me back, she whispered. Jacob turned toward her. Who? Emily looked at him with desperation in her eyes. My father's men. Jacob frowned. Why would your father send men after you? Emily swallowed hard. Because I ran away. Why? Tears formed in her eyes. Because he was going to marry me to someone I didn't choose. Jacob had heard stories like that before. Rich landowners forcing their daughters into marriage to strengthen alliances. But sending armed riders after her. That meant the man she refused must have been powerful. Or dangerous. Or both. The hoofbeats were louder now. The riders were approaching quickly. Emily stood up in panic. What do we do? Jacob grabbed his rifle and checked the chamber. His face remained calm, but his mind was moving fast. How many men? 4. Armed? Yes. Jacob sighed quietly. Of course they were. He looked across the open plains. No place to hide. No trees. No rocks. Just miles of open land. Which meant one thing. If those riders reached the campfire, there would be questions. And maybe trouble. Jacob turned back to Emily. You got 2 choices. She stared at him anxiously. What? You can walk away right now and pretend you never met me. Emily's face fell. And the second, Jacob looked toward the approaching hoofbeats. Then back at her. Or you stay behind me. Emily's voice trembled. What happens if I stay? Jacob's eyes hardened slightly. Then those men will have to explain to me why they're chasing a woman across the plains in the middle of the night. The hoofbeats grew louder. The riders were close now. Emily looked at Jacob, then at the darkness behind them, then back at the fire. She knew she couldn't outrun horses. Slowly, she stepped behind him. Jacob gave a small nod. All right then. He lifted his rifle slightly and waited. Within seconds, 4 riders appeared on the edge of the firelight, and the man leading them didn't look friendly. The frontier night had just become dangerous. Riders in the dark, the sound of hoofbeats thundered across the quiet plains. Within seconds, 4 riders emerged from the darkness and stopped at the edge of Jacob's campfire. Their horses snorted as they pulled the reins tight. Dust swirled in the cold night air. Jacob stood still, his rifle resting loosely in his hands. He didn't point it, but he didn't lower it either. Emily remained behind him, gripping the wool blanket around her shoulders. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain the riders could hear it. The man in front stepped forward. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a black coat and a wide hat that shadowed his face. A revolver hung at his side. His eyes moved from Jacob, to the fire, and finally to Emily. A slow smile appeared on his lips. "Well now," the man said, his voice rough. "Looks like we found her." Emily froze. Jacob didn't move. The man nudged his horse a few steps closer. "You mind stepping aside, cowboy?" he said casually. "That girl belongs to us." Jacob's jaw tightened slightly. "Does she now?" The rider tilted his head. "She ran away from home. Her father wants her returned." Jacob glanced over his shoulder. Emily shook her head desperately. "That's not the truth," she whispered. Jacob looked back at the riders. "Funny thing," he said calmly. "She doesn't seem eager to go." The rider chuckled. "Most runaway girls ain't." One of the other men leaned forward in his saddle. "Boss, let's just grab her and go." Emily's fingers tightened in the blanket. Jacob slowly stepped forward, placing himself fully between the riders and the fire. "That ain't happening," he said quietly. The leader's smile faded. "You planning to make trouble over a girl you met 5 minutes ago?" Jacob shrugged slightly. "Not planning anything." His eyes hardened. "But if 4 armed men ride up in the middle of the night trying to drag a woman away, I start asking questions." The riders exchanged glances. The leader sighed. "You don't understand, friend." He leaned forward in the saddle. "That girl is the daughter of Thomas Whitaker." Jacob's expression didn't change, but Emily's breathing stopped. Thomas Whitaker was one of the richest landowners in the entire region. His ranch stretched across miles of Texas land, and his reputation wasn't exactly friendly. The rider continued. "She ran away before her wedding tomorrow morning." Jacob glanced at Emily again. "Wedding?" Emily's voice shook. "I told you, I didn't choose it." The rider laughed harshly. "Choice ain't part of it, girl." Jacob's grip on the rifle tightened slightly. "Who's the lucky groom?" he asked. The rider smirked. "Lucky ain't the word. Powerful is." He paused for effect. "Marshall Carter Hayes." Jacob's eyebrows lifted slightly. Now that name he knew. Carter Hayes was the town marshal of Red Ridge. A man feared across half the frontier. Not because he followed the law, but because he twisted it. Emily's voice trembled behind him. "He's twice my age." The rider shrugged. "Your father made the deal. Land for marriage." Jacob exhaled slowly. So that was the truth. A business arrangement disguised as a wedding. Emily's voice cracked. "If I marry him, my life is over." The rider rolled his eyes. "Oh, spare us the drama." He looked back at Jacob. "You done playing hero yet?" Jacob didn't respond. The rider's patience began to fade. "Move aside, cowboy." The other riders shifted in their saddles. Their hands hovered near their guns. Emily felt her stomach twist with fear. Jacob noticed, and something inside him stirred. Maybe it was the memory of someone he once failed to protect. Or maybe it was simply the way Emily stood there, terrified but refusing to give up. Either way, he made his decision. Jacob stepped forward. "Here's the thing," he said calmly. The riders waited. "She asked to sit by my fire." He looked directly at the leader. "And while she's here, nobody's dragging her anywhere." The night went completely silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. The leader stared at Jacob for several seconds. Then he slowly laughed. "You're serious?" Jacob didn't answer. The rider's laughter stopped. "Do you have any idea who you're standing against?" Jacob shrugged again. 4 tired men on horses. One of the riders angrily pulled his revolver halfway out of its holster. "Boss, I say we shoot him." Emily gasped softly, but the leader raised a hand, stopping the man. His eyes remained locked on Jacob. You must really like dying for strangers. Jacob replied quietly. Not dying. He slightly lifted the rifle. Just making sure nobody leaves here bleeding. The tension grew thick. 4 riders, 1 cowboy, and a terrified woman standing behind him. The fire crackled loudly between them. Finally the leader spoke again. You know what happens if you interfere with Thomas Whitaker's business. Jacob met his gaze without fear. No, but I'm guessing you're about to tell me. The man leaned forward slightly in his saddle. You disappear. The threat hung in the cold night air. Jacob simply nodded once. Then he said something that surprised everyone. Then you boys better make sure I don't ride into town tomorrow morning. The riders looked confused. Why? The leader asked. Jacob's voice turned colder. Because if I do, I'll be telling the sheriff how 4 men tried to kidnap a woman in the middle of the night. The riders exchanged uneasy glances. Even in the wild frontier, kidnapping wasn't something a sheriff ignored. The leader's smile faded again. You think the sheriff would believe you? Jacob looked at Emily, then back at the riders. I think he'd believe her. Emily's eyes filled with tears. For the first time since she ran away, someone was actually standing up for her. The leader clenched his jaw. He realized something important. This cowboy wasn't bluffing, and starting a gunfight out here could bring attention they didn't want. Finally he pulled his horse's reins. Fine. He pointed at Emily. You can hide behind him tonight. His eyes turned cold. But come sunrise, we'll be waiting on the road to Silver Creek. Emily's heart sank. The rider's voice dropped into a warning. And next time, we won't ask politely. He turned his horse. The other riders followed. Within moments, the sound of hoofbeats faded back into the darkness. The plains grew quiet again. Jacob lowered his rifle slowly. Emily collapsed onto the rock beside the fire, her legs shaking. They'll come back, she whispered. Jacob sat down again beside the flames. Yeah. Emily looked at him nervously. What are we going to do? Jacob stared into the fire for a long moment. Then he said quietly, we're going to make sure you don't marry that marshal. Emily blinked in surprise. How? Jacob's eyes lifted toward the distant horizon. By getting you somewhere they can't follow. Emily frowned. Where is that? Jacob's answer came slowly. West. He looked back at her. Way west. Emily realized something in that moment. Her journey had only just begun, and the cowboy sitting beside the fire had just become part of it. The escape. The fire had almost burned out. Only glowing embers remained, casting faint red light across the quiet plains. Jacob sat silently, staring into the darkness where the riders had disappeared. Beside him, Emily wrapped the blanket tightly around her shoulders. Her hands were still shaking. They'll really be waiting tomorrow, she said softly. Jacob nodded. Men like that don't give up easy. Emily looked down at the ground. I didn't mean to bring trouble to your camp. Jacob shrugged. Trouble finds people out here whether they invite it or not. The wind swept across the plains again. Somewhere far away, a coyote howled. Emily stared at the empty horizon. Maybe I should just leave before sunrise, she whispered. If they catch me alone, they might let you go. Jacob shook his head immediately. That's not how men like them work. Emily looked at him. What do you mean? They'd still blame me for helping you. He added another small piece of wood to the fire. Besides, he continued, you wouldn't get far on foot. Emily knew he was right. The open plains stretched for miles in every direction. Without a horse, she wouldn't survive long. Jacob stood and walked over to Dusty. The horse lifted its head and snorted softly. Jacob gently patted the animal's neck. You still got some miles left in you, old friend. Dusty stomped his hoof as if answering. Emily watched quietly. After a moment she asked, you only have one horse? Jacob nodded. Yes. Emily frowned. How can we both ride? Jacob adjusted the saddle. We'll manage. She shook her head. That'll slow you down. Jacob looked back at her. Running alone already slowed you down. Emily didn't argue. She knew he was right. The fire finally faded to almost nothing. The sky above slowly began to change. The deep black of night softened into dark blue. Dawn was coming. Jacob tightened the saddle straps and grabbed his rifle. "We ride before the sun comes up." Emily stood quickly. Her nerves returned immediately. What if they're already waiting? Jacob swung into the saddle and then extended his hand down toward her. "Then we ride faster." Emily hesitated for a moment before taking his hand. Jacob pulled her up behind him. Dusty shifted slightly but stayed steady. "Hold on," Jacob said. Emily wrapped her arms around his waist. Her grip was tight. "Ready?" he asked. Emily took a deep breath. "Yes." Jacob kicked the reins lightly. Dusty began moving across the plains. The cold morning air rushed past them as they rode into the fading darkness. For a while, everything was quiet. Only the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves filled the air. Emily rested her head slightly against Jacob's back. "You didn't have to help me," she said after a while. Jacob kept his eyes on the horizon. "Maybe not. Then why did you?" Jacob didn't answer immediately. The wind moved through the tall grass around them. Finally he said quietly, "I once failed someone who needed help." Emily didn't ask more. She could hear the regret in his voice. They rode for nearly an hour. The sky was turning orange along the horizon. The sun would rise soon. Jacob guided Dusty toward a narrow dirt trail that cut through the plains. Emily looked around nervously. "Where are we going?" "There's an old trading post west of here," Jacob said. "Abandoned for years. Will they know about it?" "Probably." Emily's heart sank. "Then why go there?" Jacob gave a small smile. "Because they'll think we won't." For the first time since running away, Emily allowed herself to hope. Maybe they could actually escape. But the moment didn't last long. Suddenly Dusty's ears twitched. Jacob noticed instantly. The horse slowed slightly. Emily felt the tension in his body. "What is it?" she whispered. Jacob didn't answer. Instead, he turned his head slightly and looked behind them. Far across the plains, a cloud of dust was rising. Emily followed his gaze. Her stomach dropped. "4 riders. The same 4. They found us," she whispered in panic. Jacob urged Dusty to move faster. "Looks like it." The riders were still far away, but they were gaining speed. Emily's heart pounded. "They're going to catch us." Jacob's voice stayed calm. "Not if we reach the canyon first." "What canyon?" "You'll see." Dusty galloped harder now, hooves pounding the ground. The wind rushed past them. Behind them, the riders pushed their horses faster. The distance slowly began shrinking. Emily glanced back again. "They're closer." Jacob knew. But he didn't slow down. The plains ahead suddenly changed. The flat land dropped sharply into a rocky canyon. Emily's eyes widened. "You're not planning to ride down that?" Jacob leaned forward slightly. "We're not riding down." Dusty reached the edge and stopped. Emily looked over the side. A narrow path twisted down the canyon wall. Barely wide enough for one horse. "If we fall, we won't." Jacob carefully guided Dusty onto the narrow trail. The horse stepped cautiously along the rocky edge. Behind them, the riders reached the canyon. They slowed their horses. Even from the distance, Emily could hear one of them shout angrily. The trail was too narrow for them to ride quickly. Jacob allowed himself a small breath of relief. "See," he said quietly. Emily looked back one more time. The riders were still coming. But much slower now. For the moment, they had gained time. As Dusty reached the bottom of the canyon, the rising sun painted the sky bright orange. Emily looked around the rocky landscape. "Where do we go now?" Jacob stared toward the distant western hills. "Farther." Emily frowned. "How far?" Jacob answered with quiet determination. "Far enough that no one can force your life ever again." Emily held onto him a little tighter. For the first time since she ran away, she felt like she might actually be free. But Jacob knew something Emily didn't. The men chasing them weren't the only danger waiting on the frontier. And the hardest part of their journey was still ahead, the choice that changed everything. The canyon walls rose high around them as Jacob guided Dusty along the rocky floor below. Morning sunlight slowly spilled over the edge of the cliffs, turning the red stone bright and warm. But the air between Jacob and Emily was still tense. Behind them, somewhere above the canyon, the riders were still searching. Emily glanced back nervously. "Do you think we lost them?" Jacob kept his eyes forward. For now, she repeated quietly. "Those men are being paid to find you," Jacob said. "They won't quit easy." Emily lowered her head. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt." Jacob looked back at her briefly. "You didn't do anything wrong. I ran away from my family. You ran away from being sold." Emily didn't answer, because deep down, she knew that was exactly what had happened. They continued riding through the canyon for nearly another hour. Eventually the rocky walls began to widen. Ahead of them, the land opened into a quiet valley surrounded by hills. In the center of the valley stood an old wooden building. Half of the roof had collapsed. The windows were broken. Emily pointed toward it. "Is that the trading post?" Jacob nodded. "Used to be busy 20 years ago." Dusty slowed as they approached. Jacob dismounted first and helped Emily down. Her legs felt weak after the long ride. She looked around the empty valley. "Do you think they'll find this place?" Jacob tied Dusty to a wooden post. "If they search long enough, maybe." Emily felt fear creeping back again. "Then what do we do?" Jacob walked inside the old building. Dust covered the wooden floor. Broken shelves leaned against the walls. But the structure still provided shelter. "For now," Jacob said, "we rest." Emily sat down near the wall. For the first time in 2 days, she allowed her body to relax. But her mind refused to rest. "Jacob," he looked up. "Yes, why are you really helping me?" Jacob paused. That question had been waiting for a long time. He sat down across from her. 3 years ago, he began slowly, "I had someone in my life." Emily listened quietly. Her name was Sarah. Jacob's voice softened as he spoke. "She believed in things I didn't believe in anymore: hope, second chances." Emily could hear the pain behind his words. "What happened to her?" she asked gently. Jacob stared at the wooden floor. "One night a group of men came to our ranch." Emily's stomach tightened. "They wanted the land." Jacob nodded. "I tried to fight them." He looked away. "But there were too many." Emily's voice was barely a whisper. "Did they?" Jacob nodded once. "They burned the ranch." Silence filled the room. Emily felt tears forming in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Jacob gave a faint smile. "I spent the last 3 years telling myself I couldn't have stopped it." He looked up at her. "But when you showed up at my fire last night, scared and alone." His voice grew quieter. "I realized something." Emily waited. Jacob finished the sentence slowly. "I couldn't fail someone again." Emily's eyes filled with tears. Before she could respond, a gunshot echoed across the valley. Both of them froze. Jacob moved instantly toward the window. Emily's heart pounded. "What was that?" Jacob looked outside. His expression hardened. "Trouble." Emily rushed beside him. At the far end of the valley, 5 riders were approaching. Not 4, 5, and the man riding in front wore a long black coat. Emily's face turned pale. "That's him." Jacob didn't need to ask. "Marshal Hayes," she whispered. The riders stopped about 50 yards away. The marshal slowly dismounted. He walked forward calmly, as if he already owned the place. "Emily Whitaker," he shouted. His voice echoed through the valley. "You've caused quite a bit of trouble." Emily stepped back nervously. Jacob walked outside. The marshal noticed him and smirked. Well, Hayes said. "The brave cowboy." Jacob rested his hand near his revolver. "You must be the groom." The marshal chuckled. "She didn't tell you how important this marriage is." Emily shouted angrily from the doorway. "I'm not marrying you." Hayes ignored her. He looked at Jacob instead. You've interfered with something that doesn't concern you. Jacob replied calmly. A woman choosing her own life concerns me. The riders behind Hayes began spreading out, surrounding the building. Hayes sighed. You've made this difficult. He slowly pulled his revolver. Step away from the girl. Jacob didn't move. Hayes raised the gun. This is your last warning. Emily's voice trembled. Jacob. But Jacob stood firm. I'm not moving. The valley became silent. Wind moved through the grass. The riders tightened their grip on their weapons. Hayes shook his head. Then you die for nothing. His finger tightened on the trigger. But before he could fire, Emily stepped forward. Stop. Everyone froze. She walked past Jacob and faced Hayes directly. You want this marriage? She shouted. Hayes narrowed his eyes. Then hear this clearly. Her voice was strong now. I would rather die than marry you. The words echoed across the valley. Hayes' face turned dark with anger. You foolish girl. Jacob stepped beside her again. And suddenly something unexpected happened. One of the riders behind Hayes spoke. Marshall, maybe this ain't worth it. Another rider nodded. She's made her choice. Hayes spun around furiously. You're being paid. The rider shrugged. Not enough to shoot people over a wedding. The others slowly lowered their guns. Hayes realized something terrible. His men weren't willing to fight. Not for this. Not today. For a long moment he stared at Emily. Then at Jacob. Finally he holstered his gun. This isn't over, he said coldly. He turned and mounted his horse. The riders followed. Within minutes, they were gone. The valley fell silent again. Emily stood there, shaking. Jacob looked at her. You all right? She nodded slowly. Then something surprising happened. Emily began to laugh. Softly at first, then louder. Jacob smiled slightly. What's funny? Emily wiped tears from her eyes. For the first time in my life. She looked toward the open valley. I'm free. Jacob glanced at the wide western horizon. Miles of open land stretched endlessly. So what now? He asked. Emily thought for a moment. Then she smiled. I go west. Jacob chuckled. That's a big direction. Emily looked at him. You could come with me. Jacob raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? Emily nodded. You're the first person who ever stood up for me. Jacob looked out across the plains again. For years he had been wandering without purpose. But now, for the first time since losing everything, the road ahead didn't feel empty. He turned back to her. All right, Emily smiled. They saddled Dusty together, and as the sun rose high above the Texas frontier, two travelers rode west, not running anymore, but chasing a new life. Together. Please friends spot my channel, subscribe for more stories. Like, share, comment.